The Kremlin can no longer do without him. President Volodymyr Zelensky states, and I quote, "For the first time in all these years, Russia can no longer fight without North Korea's help." End quote. This fact is confirmed by both intelligence and analysts. Kyiv has data that the Kremlin has already received a new batch of ballistics from North Korea and is preparing to deploy about 50,000 North Korean soldiers on its territory. How much will this help the Kremlin continue this war? And what price is Putin paying in return? Our special correspondent in the United States, Dmytro Anopchenko, sought the answers.
The weapons shortage that everyone is talking about, where industry can't keep up and missiles and ammunition are catastrophically scarce, doesn't just affect Ukraine and its Western allies. Moscow's facing it too. And it's reached the point where, without the DPRK, it could no longer continue the war at its current pace.
Putin is also frantically searching for ammunition. Even if Russia produces them at full capacity for this war, Moscow's shell shortage still remains. That's why North Korea is needed, primarily for its ballistic missiles.
Moscow has always looked down on the DPRK, considering it a junior partner, if not worse, but now it's completely dependent on Kim, American experts say. Because after the start of the U.S. military operation in Iran, the Kremlin now has nowhere to get not only missiles, but also the ammunition it lacks. According to the GER, North Korea now covers about half of the Russian army's ammunition needs at the front.
The defense industry is running at full speed. However, the war against Ukraine requires 10 to 15,000 shells every day. Moscow's shortage is obvious, and there's only one country Russia can get all this from: North Korea.
Just as it's increasingly difficult for Russia to recruit people to compensate for its losses without declaring a general mobilization, and Kim is ready to sell soldiers, says a man who once trained in the very same unit whose fighters are now fighting against Ukraine.
First and foremost, money. Kim is receiving an unprecedented flow of cash. Reportedly, Russia pays about $2,000 a month for each soldier. Kim will be able to pocket between 30 and 100 million every month.
More than 2,000 of Kim's soldiers have already died, and nearly 5,000 have been wounded. But the regime doesn't care. To him, people are just a resource, says a man who escaped the DPRK and fled to the West.
The shells and missiles that Pyongyang sent to Russia, over 6 million. Kim is making billions on weapons and the sale of soldiers. But the main thing is, not a single cent reaches the soldiers themselves or their families. Everything goes personally to the leader of North Korea.
What is Moscow paying the DPRK with, besides black cash? With technologies that Pyongyang lacks and that it wouldn't have developed on its own. And lately, there's more and more talk that Putin, in exchange for friendship and support, might have promised to transfer nuclear developments to Kim Jong Un as well.
I think we all have reason to be concerned now because previously, Russia was very skeptical about the possibility of sharing sensitive nuclear technologies with North Korea. But now, in a much more desperate situation, Putin may agree to exchange them for weapons and drones. What will Pyongyang do with what they've received? That's the big question.
What else worries both experts and military journalists? If Putin is sure that North Korea guarantees him a reliable rear, why then agree to negotiations and a truce at all, when Kim will be supplying both people and ammunition continuously?
Russia is taking advantage of Ukraine's lack of interceptors and is now using North Korean stockpiles. Everything it can get its hands on to strike at Ukraine. There are signs that Putin is settling in for a long war.
Pinner points to several signals at once that Moscow is changing its military leadership, particularly in structures responsible for logistics and drone systems. Why this if you're thinking about a truce? That in North Korea, they are massively modernizing old factories and building new ones. If there were no plans to keep fighting, why would Russia be investing?
I really have reason to believe that Putin plans to drag out the hostilities because he's preparing not just for winter, but for what comes after it. There's more and more talk now about a mass mobilization, and it looks like it really might happen. And the problem is that the Kremlin still feels confident enough to prepare for a protracted war.
And that's why analytical reports and Western press now show more than just concern that Kim opened a second front for Russia. They call for efforts to end the two dictators' cooperation, or at least stop it from deepening. From Washington, Dmytro Anopchenko, Serhiy Koval, the American Bureau of the Inner TV channel, the United News Marathon.
They want to be friends and strengthen relations with Russia. North Korean dictator Kim Jong Un announced the strengthening of cooperation between the regimes. The rapprochement between North Korea and Russia has intensified significantly after Pyongyang transferred weapons to the Kremlin's army and sent its military to participate in the war against Ukraine. According to Reuters, this is North Korea's largest involvement in an armed conflict outside the Korean peninsula since the Korean War in the 1950s. But the main resource of cooperation is the North Korean military. Where could they be sent? Does the Kremlin plan to open a new front? Or will North Korean soldiers join the Donbass assaults? I'll be asking Serhiy Bratchuk about this, a military expert and spokesperson for the Ukrainian Volunteer Army. Mr. Serhiy, I welcome you. Glory to Ukraine.
Glory to the heroes. Glory to our defenders. Greetings.
So I will refer to President Volodymyr Zelensky. His message mentions the deployment of up to 50,000 North Korean troops in Russia. And what do you know about the composition? These are combat units, engineering units. What is known about women in this group?
Well, actually, we have to start with the fact that for the North Korean army, it's not, let's say, very difficult to maintain these contingents on the territory of the Russian Federation and, with the help of the Russian military, carry out the necessary training. It's quite likely this group of 50, maybe even a bit more than 50,000 fighters could already be at training grounds in the Russian Federation, undergoing the relevant training. First of all, we are, of course, talking about the Far East. It's quite possible that some units could already appear, specifically in the Kursk region, because in the Kursk region, as you know, the enemy used this auxiliary component from Kim Jong Un, which helped realize the ambitions the Russians had to force the Ukrainian troops there to eventually end their operation. First of all, we're talking about the fact that, well, the North Korean army consists of at least 1,200,000 to 1,300,000 people, plus several million reservists. So this group of 50, 60, or 70,000 is no problem at all. And actually, what are we talking about first and foremost? Obviously, these are infantry units. Clearly, these are engineering and construction units that have already been building, as far as we know, fortifications, specifically in the Russian border areas. And it's quite likely that the locations for deploying such a contingent could be the Kursk region, as I mentioned, Belgorod, Bryansk, and quite possibly the northwestern part of the Voronezh region. So it's clear that this attempt by the Kremlin to use these units, and it will likely be successful for them, is aimed at freeing up exclusively Russian combat units currently in the Russian border regions to redeploy them to the most active sectors of the Russian-Ukrainian front. And the North Koreans will basically replace them there. As I said, these are engineering, construction, and infantry units. As for women, there is no information yet regarding the participation of women in these North Korean army contingents. But we know that, for example, the Russian labor market has collapsed due to the massive losses of Russian occupiers in Ukraine. So today, North Korean women, like the men, are being brought into the defense sector of the Russian economy, specifically light industry. So it's obvious they're already in the Russian Federation, trying to fill the labor shortage that has emerged in Russia today. And this crisis will only continue to deepen.
Mr. Serhiy, I'd like to focus on the numbers, though. I recall that the Russians' offensive potential in the Avdiivka direction was 40,000. Remember when the Russians broke through the border in 2024 and began an offensive in the Kharkov region? There was also talk of 40,000 plus there. So that is a sufficient grouping, 50,000, in order to go on the offensive. What do you think? Will the Russian command use the North Koreans as a separate grouping, or will they disperse them along their own units? And how will the language issue be resolved then? Because when the Kursk operation was underway, we later spoke with the company commander of the 132nd Reconnaissance Battalion, and he said that interaction was exactly the weak point, because the Russian command was dealing with North Koreans who do not speak Russian.
Well, first of all, we are modeling possible situations, possible scenarios for the participation of North Koreans in the Russo-Ukrainian war, although they have already been used by the Russians exclusively on Russian territory. I think that for now, the Russians will not openly, perhaps until a certain time, we do not know this, use North Koreans directly on the territory of our state. It is quite likely that 15 to 20,000, maybe even no more, combat-ready Russian fighters will be transferred as these reservists from the territory of the Russian Federation to the hottest areas, as I mentioned. These could be, respectively, the Donetsk front, North and South Slobozhansky, Zaporizhia. Well, the Russian command will decide that because today it is obvious that there are problems with losses. The Russians can't fully cover them. Moreover, in some sectors of the front, especially on the Donetsk front, the Russians are forced to use operational, tactical, and even strategic reserves today. Not completely, but such a trend exists today. So regarding the participation of North Koreans there, specifically on the battlefield, well, for now it is still a question, but they do free up the Russians' hands. And actually, a very good question, it remains relevant, that is interaction. So if we can talk about the tactical compatibility of Russian units with North Korean ones, maybe some experience appeared after the Kursk region, but the language barrier that exists and will obviously continue to exist because, well, you can't attach an interpreter to every squad, every platoon, every company of North Koreans. First of all, even if there is one, we understand that it simply slows down both the issuing of commands and the making of relevant decisions. We perfectly understand that it is unlikely the North Koreans, will mix with the Russians in battle formations, in the trenches, and attack together. It is quite likely that the North Koreans might remain in these solid blocks at the battalion level, maybe a brigade, which can be used in one sector of the front or another. That is, densely across the area. Clearly, I will say it again, the language barrier will be a key issue for them. Moreover, the experience that the North Koreans have today, they are using it specifically for training their own fighters on the territory of North Korea, meaning also those who went through the Kursk region. There were a lot of casualties there. Those who returned, they stayed in North Korea. Yes, I admit that. And of course, there's some there, maybe a few hundred, maybe a bit more North Koreans who went through Kursk. They'll be in these units now. But will they solve the issue of such tactical interaction right on the battlefield? I don't think so. So for the Russians and for the North Koreans, it's a huge problem.
Mr. Serhiy, again, I'll refer to information I received from paratroopers who took part in the Kursk operation, where scouts directly encountered and captured North Koreans. They noted quite high infantry training and the level of preparation of the North Koreans. But in return, what does Kim Jong Un get from Putin? Isn't it most interesting for him to send his military to gain experience specifically in the drone component of this war?
Well, I want to point out that our units of the Ukrainian Volunteer Army also took part in the Kursk operation. Accordingly, we're talking today about a separate regiment than the Ara Battalion. So there's relevant experience there too. If we're talking about tactical training, well, what can we note then and now? For individual tactical training of specific soldiers, the North Korean army, it stands out. It differs from the Russian one in terms of drill. It's quite high-level training. But again, this is individual tactical training, first of all. And secondly, it was based, at least until recently, and is mostly based on tactical ideas used back in the 20th century. War has changed today. Today, there isn't even a classic front line. But the North Koreans, they understand. There are trenches, there's an enemy, and they act against them. As for unit interaction, of course, the North Koreans don't have such experience in modern warfare, although they're trying their best to pass that Kursk experience to their troops today, and for them, it'll also be a certain problem. Will they manage to train them that effectively for today? Well, to put it mildly, I have some doubts about that. But discipline, yeah, I think it's significantly higher than the discipline in Russian army units specifically. So it's obvious that those technological advantages, thanks to which the defense forces hold their ground and conduct counterattacks, will remain our trump card for the near future for sure, especially in possible countering of North Korean fighters directly.
And what's the overall potential of North Korea's troops? Let's say, how many souls are they ready to give up if Putin, for example, as an alternative to his mobilization, to avoid causing, outrage and discontent inside the country? Can he cover the shortage of personnel in his army specifically with North Koreans?
As for the souls of North Koreans, it's obvious they've all given those souls to Kim Jong Un. And if we're talking about the potential, well, let's say, of the fighters, as I've said, it's over 1 million regular troops and, accordingly, several million reservists. So the potential is quite significant. And accordingly, these 50,000, maybe even more for the North Korean army, they look, well, if not like a walk in the park, obviously, because there will be body bags, that's also known, but they have no trouble maintaining such a contingent, especially since Russia's paying for it and paying huge amounts of money. Well, for Putin, this is important because it usually allows him, for now at least, to avoid talking about a full mobilization. The fact is that in Russia today, the temporary occupying Moscow government, it's still, it has fears that a full-scale mobilization wouldn't be perceived the way they like in Russia. But in any case, both North Koreans and Russians should remember, and North Korean wisdom says this, that there's a time when you eat the dog, but a time comes when the dog eats you.
Mr. Serhiy, I thank you for finding the time to talk with us.
Thank you.
That was Serhiy Bratchuk, military expert and spokesperson for the Ukrainian Volunteer Army.